I'm curious to know how many people here have read through the book of Leviticus. Raise your hand if you've read through the book of Leviticus. Okay, some people have read through the book of Leviticus. Raise your hand if you understood the book of Leviticus. Pastor Keith, thank you. Yes, good. Excellent. Leviticus is a very, very strange book to us. It has strange laws, it has strange sacrifices, and it has these weird festivals that really don't have any meaning to us now. But I think that Leviticus is very, very important for us. And I think that if we start to understand the book of Leviticus, it doesn't seem so strange to us because we all have holidays. We celebrate Christmas and Easter. People from an Orthodox background or Catholic background, they might celebrate other holidays like Ascension Day or Pentecost. We have our own rituals that we have in our lives. We celebrate birthdays. We celebrate our Independence Days or national days from our countries. And of course, in America, a personal favorite of mine is Thanksgiving with all the turkey and food. And then we have laws, and even we have laws that to people outside of our time or our country might seem strange. And some of you might be seeing in the news every once in a while that there is an election going on in America, and many of you probably thinking, what is going on with that? It seems strange, it seems weird. I can assure you there is a little bit of a method to the madness, a little bit. But these are all things that someone looking outside, looking in, might think, well, that's really strange. Why do they do that? And I think that there's an element in which, because we are not part of Israel, because we're not steeped in that culture, we don't understand the language of the sacrifices, and we don't understand the language of the rituals and the festivals and what they mean. And so, and this atonement sacrifice that we read about this morning, this is right in the middle of Leviticus. And it's a ritual that they went through once a year. It was one of their holidays. And some people might be thinking, well, yeah, that's great. That's great that Israel did it 3,000 years ago, but what sort of purpose, what sort of meaning does that have for us as Christians on this side of the cross, on this side of God's work? Why even talk about it now? Well, I want to give you two reasons why I think that it's good in general to look at the book of Leviticus, and two reasons, and also why I think this passage has something for us, and Leviticus in general has something for us. And we're going to look at just one passage today, but I think this applies to the whole book. First of all, Timothy says, in 1 Timothy it says that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, and that includes the book of Leviticus. In fact, he was probably talking mostly about the law and the prophets, meaning Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So he's talking about these books, and he's saying all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching. And the second thing is that so many of these things that are in the Old Testament, the purpose of the Old Testament ultimately is to tell God's redemption story. And there's so much in the Old Testament that ultimately points back to Jesus. And so when we look at these passages, the question that should always be in the back of our mind is, what does this tell us about Christ? What does this tell us about the work of Jesus on the cross? And so that's what we're going to look about today. And I think this is a good time of the year to do it as Easter is coming up and we begin to prepare to celebrate Christ's work on the cross. And I think that one of the things to remember is that all of these sacrifices, all of these rituals, they are intended to be reminders of something else that has happened. And one of the important rituals that we engage in on a very regular basis is communion. On a regular basis, we take the wine and we take the bread, and it is a picture for us, it is a reminder for us of something that God has done. We are not necessarily saved by taking communion. We are not saved by taking the wine. We are saved by grace. We are saved by Christ's work on the cross. But these things are reminders for us, important reminders for us. In the same way, these rituals were reminders for the people of Israel about things that God had done for them or was going to do for them in the future. Now, this particular passage in Leviticus, this is right in the middle of the book. So there's all sorts of laws and sacrifices before. There's all sorts of laws and sacrifices and festivals after. But this is right in the center of the book. And this was possibly one of the most important rituals in Leviticus. So we're going to do two things today. First of all, we're going to talk about what is the sacrifice. So I want us to think about what this sacrifice is and what is happening here. And then after that, we'll think about, well, how does this relate to Jesus? Because in some ways, the sacrifice illustrates things that Jesus did, but in some ways, there are limitations to that sacrifice that Jesus then completed. So we're going to look at those two things. So first of all, let's start talking about the sacrifice. If I can get my clicker to work. There we go. Oh, that's all right. I've already done these rituals. I think one of the first things before we get into it is to understand the layout of the temple a little bit. So in these sacrifices, the Israelites would come together, they'd come to the temple, and there was a big temple right here that was probably, I'm going to guess a little bit, maybe about, let's say, the size of this church building. That'd be about right? Maybe a little bit bigger, okay? And then inside, there was another building, there was a smaller building that had 2 rooms in it. And there was this room right here that only the priests could go into. And then there was the Ark of the Covenant, and this was the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could go in there, and he could only go in once a year. Okay? Now, usually, when the priests did sacrifices, typically, they had this ornate clothing here. It had this breastplate that had these jewels on it. They were very, very ornately dressed, and there was a purpose to that. There was a purpose to this. It showed the importance of the priests in the life of relating to God. But on the Day of Atonement, it was a little bit different. On the Day of Atonement, they wore just white linens. And I think that to get a picture of that, typically when people come to preach, whether it's Pastor Keith or Pastor Jim or someone else, people wear nice trousers, they wear a nice shirt, sometimes they even wear a tie and a suit. And so the pastor gets dressed up, and there's probably lots of reasons for that we could think of, but they look very nice. Could you imagine if Pastor Jim got up one day wearing just very plain white clothes, no shoes, hadn't shaved in a week? He would not look prim and proper. And we would probably think, well, that's very strange. It's very odd that a pastor would get up and do that. They're supposed to wear a tie. I don't have my tie on today, but it's because I'm making an illustration here. And they're supposed to wear a tie, and they're supposed to wear a suit. And so the priest was supposed to be wearing these things, and it was a stark reminder that in this particular sacrifice, the priest was entering God's presence, entering the Holy of Holies in a very humble with a very humble and simple attitude. It's a powerful picture to remember that in this sacrifice here, that God is holy, and we respect that. The second thing that happened, oops, wrong way. I don't understand what's happening. There we go. Okay. The second thing is that when the priest went inside the Holy of Holies, inside that center part there, again, he only went in there once a year, and only during this time. Okay? He would they would light this incense. And it was very specific instructions for the incense, and they had to crush it down. It had to be a certain sort of incense. And no one could enter into the Holy of Holies, remember, except for the high priest, and only once a year. And in fact, if you did the wrong thing, you would die. The high priest would die. So what they would do with the high priest is they'd actually tie a rope to his foot, and if something happened, if he died, they would be able to pull him out because someone else could not go in. And in fact, there's a story before this where Aaron's 2 sons had gone into the temple, and they had offered what were called strange fires. We don't really know what the meaning of this was, but the point was is that they didn't follow the guidelines that had been set out, and they were killed. They died. Now that seems very strange to us. We think, well, that's very strange. Why would a God of grace and mercy cause someone to die because of just not following the rules? Why would God cause someone to die if I did not get up and follow the right procedures in the church? And it seems a very strange thing to us. But one of the things that this was illustrating, and this was so important, and it is so important in all of Leviticus, is the seriousness of God's holiness. And anything that is unholy in God's presence gets burned up and dies. And so you think, well, why can't God just give us a break? Why can't he just, why do people have to be perfect? That seems so unreasonable. And I think a good illustration for this is the sun. No one says to the sun, "Sun, why won't you just let a space shuttle land on your surface? Why won't you just let astronauts go and be on your surface and study the sun? It would be great. We could probably learn so many things. Why not?" And the answer is, well, if you try and land on the surface of the sun, you'll get burned up. And so in a similar way, God's nature, his nature of holiness, cannot withstand, I shouldn't say cannot withstand, things that are unholy cannot withstand God's holiness any more than the sun can withstand anything that is not made to be on the sun. And so it was so important for the priest to offer that. In fact, part of the purpose of the incense was to put a cloud in the Holy of Holies, because God's presence was right there. God's presence was there, and his presence, his holy presence, is so powerful. His holy presence is so powerful that it cannot be withstood. We're going to come back to this point, okay? Because I think this is a hard thing for us to understand sometimes. We're going to come back to this later. After they had put the incense, the next thing that they would... There we go. The next thing that they would do is that the priest would offer a sacrifice for the bull. Sorry, not for the bull. He would offer a bull as a sacrifice for the priest's sin. So before the high priest could even go into the Holy of Holies, he would have to offer this sacrifice for his own sins. And one of the things we need to remember is that the wages of sin is what? The wages of sin is death. So before the priest could go into God's holy presence, he needed to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. Because every day people were doing things that broke God's law. Now, of course, later on, the priests, and probably even at this time, the priests would go around and they would picture themselves perfect. We have kept all of God's laws. And Jesus would blow that right out of the water and get to the heart, which is really what the issue is. And people had no idea people then started to understand again why these sacrifices were not enough. And the next thing they'd do is they'd take the blood of the bull and they'd start sprinkling it around the holy place. And the purpose of that was to get rid of anything that was unclean. Now, again, that sounds very strange to us. Could you imagine if Pastor Keith got up one day, slit the throat of a lamb up here, sprinkled the blood up here, and started sprinkling all of the worship equipment with the blood? These guys down here are getting real uncomfortable with this. It's just an illustration. We're not going to do it today, okay? I'll let you know if we do it, and you can get the equipment out of the way before we do it, okay? But they're sprinkling this blood everywhere because again, the high priests, they were doing things that were unholy. They had caused unholiness to come in. And so they're sprinkling this blood. And the question, well, why the blood? That seems so gross. Because blood had a very, very specific symbolic value, and it meant life. And we still see that in the work of Christ on the cross, that we are covered by his blood because blood was life. It was a very, very important symbol for life. Now, in all of these, remember that the bull sacrifice, the priest was not thinking that, yes, my sins are actually forgiven. This was a symbol. The bull sacrifice, all these other sacrifices, these are a symbol that God should have, in his holiness, punished sin with death. But he did not. He passed over their sin. And this is a reminder that there has to be death somewhere because of people's sin. And so in the future, someday, something else would have to happen. They didn't know exactly what that was. We know what that is. We know what that perfect sacrifice was. But this sacrifice, this bull sacrifice, it was not intended to be the actual thing that would cause forgiveness or cause them to their sins to be washed away. But it was a symbol of something that was going to take place. And then after the bull sacrifice, there were 2 goats that were brought. And they would cast lots as to which goat would be sacrificed and which goat would become what was called the scapegoat. And you might have heard that word before, scapegoat. And so they would go through the ritual of offering the first goat as a sacrifice, and it was burned on the altar of the Lord. For the second goat, the priest would pray all of the sins of the people over the head of the goat. And we don't really know how long this prayer was. Was it, God, we pray all the sins of the people on this goat? Did he go through people's sins one by one? But you can imagine that even if you start to get into even a little bit of detail, that prayer is going to be very, very, very long. And the second goat, it was led out into the wilderness. Someone led it, there's an appointed person, that person led it out into the wilderness, and it stayed there. And it was led so far away that it would never even be able to come back. Now, to understand, I think, to help us understand the seriousness of this sacrifice, I think there's some things that we need to remember. And you see this in the rest of Leviticus. This is not the only sacrifice in Leviticus. There are 3 other sacrifices that are specifically for sin. And they were offered on a regular basis. On a regular basis, people are bringing sacrifices to the temple in order to make atonement for their sin. And we see this actually when Jesus turns the tables over in the temple, because some smart person figured out that if I sit in front of the temple and sell someone a dove, they're just going to buy it from me instead of going out to try and find their own dove. And then someone said, well, I can get even closer. And eventually they were inside the temple selling the stuff, and Jesus said, that is not okay. That is not what the temple is for. The temple is not a marketplace. But they were giving these sacrifices all the time. Weekly, monthly, yearly. It never ended. And this goat, even though it took the mother load, this goat, it was called the scapegoat. It took all the sins of the people and it took it out of the camp, and it never came back. Those sins never came back, but yet they had to do the next sacrifice the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. The sacrifices never ended. Now, all this is symbolic, and the people knew that God was passing over their sins with grace and mercy. But this whole process was atonement. It was atoning for their sins. Their sin, their uncleanness, their unholiness was causing a gap between God. They were separated. We were separated. And the sacrifice was an atoning sacrifice, or it was an at-one-ment atonement. And it brought God and people back together. Atonement means to cover up, to purge, to reconcile. And this was a symbol of God covering his people's sins, his purging of their unholiness, and making the relationship right. You can probably already see some of the similarities here that Jesus has in the cross. And maybe you might be able to see some differences. So let's look at some of the similarities and some of the differences here. I'm going to give you 2 similarities. And this is the first thing. That the wages of sin is death. Whenever there was a sin sacrifice, something had to die. And this was to show the seriousness of sin and the seriousness of God's holiness. And so remember that death is not simply a punishment because God is annoyed with us. Death because of sin is not because God is annoyed with sin. Death is a punishment for sin because our unrighteousness cannot withstand the holiness of God. And I think this is very, very important for us all to remember, because that's a key thing for anybody who is in any sort of leadership position. Whether it is the pastors, whether it is the board, whether it is the ministry leaders, whether it is you as parents, is that the wages of sin is death. And one of the purposes of leadership that we have in the church is to make sure that we are in right relationship with God. Now, that's not to say that we look down on people who have sinned, because we should be first looking at our own lives. But it's to say that our hearts should break when we see unholiness around us, and we should be inviting people back to holy relationship with God. Jonathan Edwards, you may have heard that name before. He gave a famous sermon. He was a pastor in early American history, and he gave a famous sermon. And some people like it and some people don't. And it was titled this. It was titled, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And it was a very fire and brimstone sermon. But Jonathan Edwards also understood something. He understood that sin separates us from God, and that full joy can only be experienced with God. And that the wages of sin is death. It's a very serious thing. Sin is not a joke. Sin is not just an annoyance that we need to deal with. Sin separates us from God, and the wages of sin is death. And these sacrifices in the Old Testament remind us of that, and it reminded the Israelites of that day after day, week after week, year after year. The second thing that we learn from this is that the goat, the substitute, must be unblemished. You couldn't just go out to your herd and pick whatever goat you wanted to. You couldn't go out and say, well, you know what, that one's pretty sickly, he's old, he's going to die anyways next month. I'm going to pick that one and we'll go take it to the sacrifice. It's not a loss for us. You had to pick the most perfect goat, and all the other sacrifices, the most perfect lamb, or whatever animal it was. You couldn't pick just anyone. And some of you may have, and one of the things in this culture, very pastoral culture, is that they probably would have, many people, particularly people who are not as wealthy, would have become very close with their animals. The sheep listened to the shepherd's voice and knew it and followed them. And so there was an emotional connection with that. And so people became close with it. And so when you're picking out the unblemished one, it was probably an animal that you cared about and had some sort of, and some of us have animals here. Some people may have dogs, some people may have cats or other animals. And that would be a similar thing as saying to someone, well, you know what, take your dog or take your cat or take that pet that you have and you sacrifice that. It's not an easy thing to do. But it reminds us that they were close. This was a sacrifice. This is something they had to give up. But also because something that is impure cannot withstand something that is pure. Unrighteousness, and now remember, these are pictures, so we're not saying that that a blemished goat or a blemished lamb is sinful or unholy. These are pictures, right? But something that is holy cannot withstand something that is unholy cannot withstand something that is holy. This is a picture of the space shuttle. These are the shuttles that America used to use. They don't use them anymore. But you notice under the space shuttle here are all these, it's very black, it's all this black tiling. And this is a very special black tiling that they used on the shuttles. And it's really, really interesting. I had a chance to see these one time. And they're made to withstand tens of thousands of degrees of heat. And so when the space shuttle re-enters the Earth, there's so much friction in the air that it causes the bottom of the shuttle to heat up. And in fact, there's been times when the shuttle has cracked apart and exploded. Some of you might remember the Challenger disaster that happened, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. And these tiles were specifically designed to withstand heat. And so you could actually take a blowtorch and hold it up to the tile. And as soon as you take it off, you could stick your hand on that tile and it's completely cool to the touch. And that's why they use them on the shuttle. Because if you don't have those tiles there, the whole shuttle is going to burn up. And Christ is in some ways our ceramic tiling. He is a covering, a holy covering that can withstand the wrath of God because he is unblemished and he is holy. And you could imagine that someone said, well, you know what? I'm not going to worry about Christ. I'm just going to do it on my own. It would be like putting wood on the bottom of that shuttle. And I guarantee you within seconds that shuttle would be cracking apart and breaking up under the heat of the reentry. Christ is our ceramic tiling. He is our unblemished sacrifice, our perfect sacrifice, who can withstand God's wrath. The third thing here is that it removes our sin. So when they took the scapegoat out, they had to take it far, far away so it could never come back. And sometimes sometimes what they do is they take it to a place where they knew it was going to fall off a cliff, so they knew it wouldn't come back, or a predator was going to get it. Because they did not want those sins that they had laid on that goat to re-enter into the community. And Psalm 103, verse 12 says this, that he has removed our sins as far as the east is from the west. And this was a picture for the people, that the sins were removed and would not come back. Once God has passed over them and those sins have been atoned for, they don't matter anymore. And I think that this is why when Jesus says, "Come to me, you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest," he says that his yoke is light. We are either slaves to sin or we are slaves to righteousness. It's one of the two. But being a slave to righteousness means that we do not have the heavy burden of sin on our backs because God has removed it as far as the east is from the west. And sometimes we forget about that and we fret over sins of the past. They come back to haunt us because we are worried about things that we have done. Sometimes it's because we're worried about someone finding out about that. But sometimes it's because the guilt of the sin weighs so heavily in our hearts and we forget that God has removed that from us. That he is faithful and just and will forgive us of our sins. And he will purify us. He is faithful to lay them on the sacrifice, on Jesus, and send them out of the camp. Now this is a model. Remember, I've said it already a couple of times, and I'll probably say it again because I think it's so important to remember this, that this is a model. This is not that the sacrifice in Leviticus were just a model, which means that the model does not do everything that the real thing does. There are differences. And let me give you two differences here between the atonement sacrifice in Leviticus and the work of Christ on the cross. First of all, Christ's sacrifice is once and for all. There is a reason that we do not need to continue the sacrifice in Leviticus. And sometimes people say that, well, there's all these old laws in the Old Testament, all these sacrifices. Why don't you Christians do them? And the reason is that it's finished. And we sang that this morning in our worship, that it is finished. We do not need to continue to give sacrifice because Christ has taken the punishment for us. And this would have been so strange to Israel, but it would have been so freeing to them because they were used to having to go down and offer sacrifices, having the priests and the scribes look down on them if they were not doing the sacrifices. And so there was this burden that was lifted because when Christ came to die, he took care of everything. Christ's death is sufficient.